Hey everybody, we're starting week eight's lecture today. A little overview, it's going to be a little shorter this week, and that's because we have a big assignment due. So we have our midterm essay assignment due today, well, at the end of this week, and that's going to be just a one-page essay, but it's going to be the introduction for your final paper at the end of due at the end of the semester. So I am also going to post a PowerPoint with multiple slides giving you tips, pointing out the requirements, really some suggestions on how to approach it. But make sure you get a citation that you involve in the assignment submission. Make sure you have all of the main requirements and you really look at that one slide closely that I put up there that says how to write an introduction. And I give you 3 bullet points and 3 goals to maintain as you work on your submission, and keep an eye on that and email me if you have any questions. That's on Eagle Online. It's posted as a whole nother PowerPoint. There are a lot of extra posts today on Eagle Online, but you'll see why as we go through the lecture. So let's get going. So learning objectives, I actually slightly changed the learning objective slide this week, and I was curious if you guys have any feedback about this. Before I was giving you generalized summaries as to what we're going to cover, just to warm you up. But I realized some of you are going to the end of the lecture to look at the what do we learn slides. So instead, I just moved the questions up a little bit, and I'm going to ask you directly the questions, and then we'll be able to answer them throughout the lecture. And then at the end, review these same questions, make sure you can answer them clearly. Well, I won't go into the detail with them right now, but we will review at the end. So let's keep going. All right. So the first thing we're covering today is understanding the difference between a united and a divided government. It is very important to understand that this has nothing to do with their ability to work together, their beliefs, or any form of compromise. United and divided governments really just summarizes who has the majority of leadership in the 3 electoral bodies within our government. These 3 electoral bodies consist of, well, right off the top of your head, the legislature, the people you appoint, you elect to draft legislation, draft bills, as we went over the legislative branch 2 weeks ago. Well, both bodies within the legislature, so the Senate and the House of Representatives. In addition to them, you have the executive branch represented by the president. So these 3 bodies, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency, if they are all led by a single political party, all majorities of a single political party, we have what's referred to as a united government. We can have issues in united governments. We can have united governments that can't work together, even when they're in the same party. I'm not saying that's what we have. What I'm saying is we have a united government. A divided government, again, has nothing to do with their ability to work together and exclusively focuses on who is in majority leadership within these 3 electoral bodies, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the executive branch through the presidency. We currently have a united government. During Joe Biden's presidency, we had a divided government, as the Senate was controlled by the Democrats, the executive by the Democrats, and then the House of Representatives by the Republicans. Now we have a united government because all 3, the House, the Senate, and the presidency, are led by majority Republicans. So the primary difference here is a united government is when we have one party governing, a divided government is when we have multiple parties governing. So now that we know the difference between a united government and a divided government relating to who is in the majority leadership positions within the 3 legislative bodies, we want to look at what these political parties even are and what their primary goal is and who makes up these political parties. So the first thing we're going to cover is who makes up the political parties. And then we're going to look at these 3 different collectives with different titles in just another slide to understand where they operate in our systems of government. So within a political party, we have politicians, activists, and voters who all have the same unified goal, which is to win control of government within a single collective. We see there are some arguments in favor of political parties in the world of political science, primarily being they act as shortcuts for political decision making. What I mean by that is, say I am a interested voter, and the only issue I really care about is taxes. I want as low of taxes as possible, but I don't really care about other issues. But I'm starting to be interested and get involved. I can use my party identification through my position on taxes to form my position on other issues. I can say, well, what are the elected representatives I prefer? What have they said about these other social issues? Well, I can use their preferences as a shortcut for my political decision making on issues that I'm not as involved with. So that's one of the primary benefits of having a two-party political system and just having political parties at large. We see that when we have political parties, we see representatives from different regions with different preferences encouraged to work together. Put simply, think of a Republican in Montana and a Republican in LA, California. They are probably very different individuals. They have probably very different party platforms. But when they meet in Washington, D.C., they can peacefully and positively discuss policy positions and work together through their through their united party identification. Now, there is an argument against political parties as they contribute to one of the primary detriments of American governance, which is political polarization. Political parties can act as a dividing point among the general population, and we're not going to cover this in this course, but if you were to continue on in political science, you would look at things called considered party sorting, in which we divide along party lines when oversimplified. But the primary takeaway from this is political parties are beneficial because they act as a shortcut for political decision making. They encourage representatives to work together, although they do have some detriments as they encourage political polarization. And when we look at political parties, we see three main collectives: politicians, those we elect; activists, those working, behind the scenes, but still with their names openly published on all forms; and voters, us. So let's go into these three individuals in more detail. So when we look at political parties, we can see it as there are three faces of a political party at all times. There is the party in the electorate, the party organization, and the party in government. Party in the electorate, when you oversimplify this, in the electorate, electoral, the people that elect the individuals. These are the members of the general public who align with one political party. We are all the people in this class. If you vote at all, you are likely a member of the party in the electorate. You are the voters. This is where we see the voters participating in the political party system. Now, when we look in a little more detail, we can see the party organization. This is the formal structure, the leadership of a political party. Think of the activists, those that are working, volunteers, those are giving their time to help the mission of the political party. You can see people knocking on doors with their free time. You can see various different ways of getting engaged. You can see the people that run the behind the scenes, those individuals that make up the structures of the political parties, the organizers, and so much more. You think of election committees, local, state, and national executives, and a lot of these individuals do get paid, and they're professional staff. They are they consistently work within the political parties. Some individuals switch political parties and work for the certain accounting dimensions of each political party. And it's like the bureaucracy in the cabinet. Party organization sometimes is more merit based for their ability to help structure and improve a political party. So think of those as the activists, the paid professional staff. A lot of individuals who go that career route start by getting a degree in political science. So we also see that there's the party in government. These are the people we talk about, all the elected and appointed officials who identify with a particular political party. So think of everybody we've elected, think of the individual appointments they've made to the cabinet or positions within the state governments. So the three faces of a political party: the voters are the party in the electorate, the activists consist of the party organization, and then the elected officials are the party in government. So when we look at what a political party is supposed to do, when we generalize it, their purpose is for recruiting candidates for public office, as they are the ones that have to bring forward a very small selection of candidates for the general population to vote for. We see this happening on a local and national level. Local political organizers local activists, we will see them often trying to recruit candidates that would fit a role very well. They try and get individuals who are engaged in the local community to run for public office. So they play a huge role in the recruiting process. This also happens on a national level, as the DNC and the RNC have a significant influence in who is going to be brought forward as presidential candidates and furthermore. And we also see they have the responsibility of organizing and running elections, and in particular primary elections. And this is something we'll cover in more detail in later weeks, but we do want to understand that the political parties have the responsibility and the power to run their primary processes. This is, again, we'll go in detail on the primary process in the next week, but we see they have the power to do this. That's why you see throughout the early 1900s a significant delay in civil rights legislation impacting the primary processes, as we had white primaries, grandfather clause, we had poll taxes, and many other barriers put in place during the primary process to uh, to prevent individuals from reaching the polls. Again, we will cover that aspect of that during the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties lecture, and we'll cover the general processes of the primary period of an electoral process I think next week. I might have those two flipped. In the next 2 weeks, those are the two topics we'll be covering. We also see that political parties accept responsibility for the operations of government. So we see that this is a very productive tool for citizens to be able to hold individuals accountable, but not just hold an individual accountable who could be replaced by a like-minded individual, but hold ideologies accountable. Hold those who implemented failing policies accountable, not just themselves, but the policies as well. So it gives the voters more power through being able to vote the opposing party into office when they are dissatisfied. And then we also see we're not just talking about the winner of elections, but also the loser of elections, as the loser of national elections, like the Democratic Party currently, acts as the organized opposition to the government in power. So we see that if you were dissatisfied, especially at a period where we have a united government, if you are dissatisfied, the next electoral primary, the next time you get to vote, you would vote for the organized opposition to replace the current government. I am in no way advocating for that. I am just simply saying when you have a united government in either way, it is very easy to see who the organized opposition is. It is the political party that does not hold a majority role in either of the three branches of government, the three electoral branches of government. So there's something called Duverger's law that explains why we have a two-party political system. Because as you've seen, we've talked about political parties at large, but we haven't really explained why there's just the Democrats and Republicans, where when we look at Europe and other nations abroad, Canada, we see parliamentary systems that have multiple parties that act and form coalitions to make majorities. But Duverger's law explains this process. It explains this by asking two general questions. These questions are: first, how many voters are needed to get representation? And second, are people encouraged to vote honestly in response to the answer to the first question? This is a bit detailed of an argument, but think of it simply. Just listen to me for a second. If you only need to get 10% of the vote to have your candidate represent you on some scale in the government, you are more willing to vote for the person you would prefer than if they needed 51%. Because if they needed 51% and they are looking like it is very unlikely for them to reach that barrier, you might vote for somebody else to avoid your worst case scenario. So let's create a scenario where, actually we'll wait till the next slide because I have this explained in more detail on the next slide. But based on the amount of representation needed to gain a seat in office, the percentage of the vote needed to gain a seat in office, this influences the way voters cast their ballot, whether they will vote for their true preference or vote for a secondary or third preference. This occurs in systems with plurality voting. Plurality voting is different from majority voting, and we'll go into this in more detail during campaigns and elections. But plurality voting is you need the most votes to win the entirety of the representation instead of needing the majority of the total votes. Say you have 3 people running for office. You do not need to get 51% to win the office as long as you have more votes than the others. You can win with 36% and everyone else, the other 2 candidates, have less than 36. So a plurality voting system makes it to where a minority of the voting population can elect the entirety of the representation of that office. This happens in single-member districts. A single-member district is a district in which you elect one individual to represent the entirety of that district. So what happens when you have a voting system in the US where you need simple plurality to win an office? You see individuals vote splitting. This is when distribution of votes among multiple similar candidates reduces the chance of winning for any of the similar candidates, increases the chance of winning for a dissimilar candidate. That starts to be considered. So if there is two candidates that represent generally Democratic policies and one candidate that represents Republican policies, you will see, even if one of the Democratic candidates is highly praised by a collection of individuals, but they're not praised by the majority of individuals within that party. Individuals will see that if you vote for your top preference, that will result in vote splitting, and you will divide the vote of the Democratic collective and almost guarantee the Republican candidate will win the office. That was just a simple example. In my mind, I was thinking Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, because I feel like that was something you saw a lot, as there was a significant population that significantly supported Bernie Sanders, but were faced with the question, do I vote for Bernie Sanders even though I know he will not win the election, or do I vote for Hillary Clinton because they more closely align with those policies? And that was something you saw millions of voters do in the United States during that time period. So it's a great example in contemporary politics, not explaining any preference for how that individual would vote in that scenario. But Duverger's law answers why we have a two-party political system. And to explain it in more detail, to break it down in a different way, let me go through it one more time. So you start with a single member district. You have a collective of 1 million individuals, but you get to elect one individual to represent all of you. So and when you have this election, only the person who wins the election wins the position of representation. Whoever gets second and third place, they simply lose, and they have absolutely no gains through this election. Now, what is the psychological effect that happens in the voter's mind when this is the environment they're voting in? Well, in these districts, people do not want to vote for a guaranteed loser. They don't want to vote for Bernie Sanders, even though that's who they prefer with their policies, but no, would not win the election in the end. So instead of voting for their true preference, which in this scenario, because it's the best contemporary example, they would not vote for Bernie Sanders, although that's their true preference. They would then choose their second preference, which in the scenario of 2016 would be Hillary Clinton. And this would be done to block their worst case scenario, which would have been in 2016 in a Democrat who likes Bernie Sanders mind. Maybe some of them might not have thought this way, but under this example, they would view Donald Trump as the worst case scenario. So they would then vote strategically. And this is that second question. Would they vote honestly? Well, in this scenario, they wouldn't, because they would know that their true preference would lose the election. So they vote for their second or third preference to avoid the worst case scenario. So they vote for Hillary Clinton in this scenario to avoid a Donald Trump presidency. Again, in no way have I expressed my preference or what I would do in this scenario. That is just the best contemporary example. And I flipped it when I provided your written example, voting Republican instead of Libertarian if you're a true Libertarian, to avoid Democrats gaining seats in the legislature. So you might not be a hardline Republican, as you might be, especially as we see in Montana, a Libertarian, but you favor Republican policies because they're your second choice, and your last choice would be a Democratic representative. Strategic voting is the example of a Libertarian voting Republican. This is Duverger's law in effect. I hope this explained it for you in more detail. If you have any questions, just email me. I'll explain this. We can hop on the Zoom. I'll explain in more detail. But a very fascinating concept. Now, we talked about how in the US we have a two-party political system. Well, we very well know these political parties, Democrats and Republicans. I wanted to very briefly give us a generalization of these two parties, the preferences they have when it comes to generalized policy positions. Now we see these generalizations challenged in recent contemporary policies because, well, it's hard to be a hardline Democrat or a Republican, as politics is nuanced. Even the most hardline candidates do not perfectly represent the ideologies at all times. think of a great example is the current contemporary push by Donald Trump for tariffs. While he is a Republican, and Republicans have a tendency to prefer free market capitalism, which does not utilize tariffs heavily. So that's just an example of how it's not a hardline way of thinking, but a consistent generalization. And it's more or less, we've tried to define our current candidates then to provide a mold that they must fit, because they do not always fit these molds. But these are generalizations when we try to explain their behavior. So Democrats, there's a tendency for them to align with liberal policies, liberal perspectives on governments, which focuses on national attempts to provide social protections. Think of this through the examples of Social Security, unemployment, welfare, Medicaid, and more. The government should respond to social inequalities or should respond to national security threats on a national level and build up those institutions. There is also a high preference with environmental policies, they tend to be concentrated in urban, which means city communities. We see a lot of LGBTQ communities aligning with the democratic and liberal policies, and that is a generalized way of understanding the democratic candidates. Heavy emphasis on national social programs and national protections for individuals. We see on the other side of the political aisle, the Republicans. We see in this party a heavy emphasis on traditional values and institutions. Remember in the past, the past lecture from week 4, I gave you an example of Edmund Burke, the father of contemporary conservatism, really. And his work focuses on how we inherited our institutions from past generations, and we need to have gradual, slow change to respect our past generations, the values in their institutions. And as you can see, it's another example of we have had in recent months some rapid changes in government led by a Republican candidate. So we see that is represented in a slightly different way, although you do see that foundation very evident in the contemporary Republican Party. Republicans often are aligned with religious groups, rural communities, think of the country, nationalist, libertarian camps. We see that very heavily represented in Montana and represent the traditional conservative values as we've discussed through Edmund Burke. And of course, when we look at past philosophers, inspiration for the Democratic Party often is viewed as John Locke, a father of liberalism. Of course, not what you would probably think of democratic liberalism in the United States, but the theoretical political theory of liberalism. And if you take my political theory course, we'll go into far more detail on that aspect right there. Now I won't go into any more detail on that, but if you looked at the notes section on this slide, I have an explanation of a work written by Matt Grossman and David Hopkins, two very respected political scientists who explored the contemporary Democratic and Republican parties and really what unifies them today. And their generalized argument is the Democratic Party is extremely diverse in their policy positions, and they are more or less a coalition of social groups seeking concrete government action. Oftentimes, Democratic policy is a specific policy that favors one of their social groups and expansion of their social rights. Now we see the Republican Party is more concentrated in a unified ideological movement whose supporters prize doctrinal purity and unification, and more ideological unifying concepts than specific policy preferences. That is what their research determined, and I significantly encourage anybody who disagrees with that conclusion, create your own research and explain why you think differently, because it's a very fascinating world, and we need contradiction in these studies, because without contradiction, you don't have theories tested fully, and we need that to really respect a conclusion. And there's been contradiction. This theory and this work has been challenged, but I always encourage you to challenge the works that you have big question marks for as well. Now, what I did for this slide and the next slide is I went to the Republican Party website and the Democratic Party websites. I think it's the GOP.org or the DNC, what their official websites. And I went to their party platforms, which I've also posted on Eagle Online. They are aids to the lecture. You do not need to read those long-winded documents. What I did is I went to the table of contents and I took the primary chapters out of their works to summarize what they currently self-identify as their party platform. Now, when you look at these, this is going to be the same for the Republican and the Democratic Party. These are extreme oversimplifications of what they're going to do. And I will make this point for both of these claims, but when you look at protect seniors, protect American workers and farmers from unfair trade, build the greatest economy in history, you do not see a specific policy position for that. Instead, just generalizations. I recommend you pause and you read through all of these to make sure you have a good take on what they self-identify as their party platform. I will continue this critique on the Democratic Party right now. Democratic Party. You see the same point I just made on the other slide, lowering costs, advancing the president's unity agenda, rewarding work, not wealth. What does that mean? Well, it's very vague on these summaries. And we can look at the detailed party platforms to see more specifically what they mean and what policies they would enact to really succeed in these goals. But these are, again, they're self-identified party positions. And this is done through conventions within the Democratic and Republican Party in which you have access to contributing. You simply have to get involved on a local level. They will select you to be a delegate. It is a very accessible process. All you have to do is go to the meeting which they hold, in which they normally don't get enough people to appoint all the delegates. So just go to a meeting in the party you identify for and raise your hand and say, I would like to be a delegate. And they will send you to the state convention. And then if you provide beneficial contributions at the state convention, which you can definitely do, especially if you've taken a class like this, you know how to engage in a very productive level, then you can be voted at the state convention to go be a representative at the national convention, where you can, as an individual, debate and work through these party platform policies. So documents on Eagle Online and on both of their websites that explain what their policy positions are. I always suggest you go through them, see what they're focusing on at the moment, and see how it aligns with your preferences. Now, we've talked about the two primary parties, almost as if third parties have never existed in the United States, but that's simply not the case. And we're actually going to look at three specific third-party candidates that have resulted in the elections of some presidents that have significantly impacted United States history. And without the third-party candidate, we can see history looking a whole lot different, in the sense of having different party realignments or different presidents who won the elections they participated in. So, third-party candidates are candidates that do not align with the two primary political parties. These individuals can significantly impact elections even when they don't win, and often represent minority positions within government. Think of socialist, libertarian, communist, extreme interpretations of mainstream positions, and far more. You see a very non-traditional party platforms. I know Bernie Sanders ran as a Democrat, but he was independent. He is an independent senator, and we also see a lot of his party positions representing a more American capitalist socialist perspective. Again, if you take political theory, you'll see socialism, capitalism, communism, all very nuanced, and there's not a single individual representative who exclusively represents one of these policies. It's very rare to have a hardline representative by the book definition. So we do see these third-party candidates often representing aspects of these positions, these ideologies that were underrepresented within the federal government. So you see this occurring. Again, I just want to repeat a term that we've covered earlier on in a pluralist system of government, the term pluralism. Remember, that is a condition or system in which two or more groups, states, principles, sources of authority, etc., coexist within a single system of government. You'll notice that definition is slightly differently worded than the other one I provided in the past, although if you really look at it with scrutiny, you would see that it is the same definition. multiple groups vying for power or coexisting within a single body of governance. So, third party candidates have in our past resulted in significant shifts in our political party identification, our political party makeup, and the winner of elections. And there are three specific examples I would like to go in right now. So, three third party candidates. One that may surprise you, Theodore Roosevelt, who actually did eventually become a presidential candidate and win as a representative of one of the two primary political parties. But before this, he ran as a Progressive Party third party candidate. He is the third party candidate who has obtained the most total vote within a presidential election. And of course, these three candidates ran for the office of the presidency. And Theodore Roosevelt obtained 27.3% of the popular vote, which resulted in Woodrow Wilson becoming the winner of that election. Without a third party Theodore Roosevelt run for president, we might not have seen vote splitting, resulting in Woodrow Wilson winning the presidency, a president we have heard in our history classes. Now let's fast forward a bit to 1968. Remember, this is one of the really the peak of our civil rights movement. We see governance moving in one or two directions, either pro-segregationist or anti-segregationist. Well, while there was a bit of shuffling among some representatives' perspectives, we see George Wallace, the governor from, I believe it was Alabama, might be Mississippi, one of the two, and he ran as an independent party candidate. He obtained 13.5% of the popular vote, and his run for presidency was founded off of the exclusive policy of pro-segregationists. He was a clear, open, pro-segregationist candidate. Now, the winner of the election he obtained 13.5% of the vote in was Richard Nixon. And we see after George Wallace's run for presidency, a significant party realignment in our two-party political system, which I will go into the term party realignment in just a moment on the next slide. But without George Wallace running, we would not have seen the Southern Dixiecrat Democrats de-aligning with the Democratic Party and realigning with the Republican Party in the 1960s, which created the political party makeup that we have to date. Now, we also see, if you fast forward a little bit more to the 1990s, in 1992, we see Ross Perot obtain 18.9% of the popular vote, outperforming George Wallace even in the years before. And Ross Perot ran on a party platform that a lot of us would identify with today. The two political parties have been far too divided, while most of the general population resides in the middle. He ran on a middle-of-the-road party platform and was identified with the Reform Party, and his third-party run for president resulted in the winner of the election being Bill Clinton. And there are arguments out there that we would not have the presidencies of Woodrow Wilson, Richard Nixon, or Bill Clinton if it weren't for third-party candidates. Just fascinating how that is. That consists of two of the very few presidents in our past that have not officially had been impeached, but had impeachment trials. Bill Clinton was officially impeached. Richard Nixon resigned before impeachment trials could be brought forward. But we see just a fascinating trend that third-party candidates gave us two of the most interesting presidencies in impeachment history, I guess you could say. I would not argue there's a connection, more or less, correlation of fascinating details. So, I talked about these terms a bit a second ago. Political realignment, party realignment, party de-alignment. Well, these are, for one, key terms to remember for this week's lectures. Now, party realignment, they're simple terms. This is when a substantial number of voters leaves one political party and realigns with the other. I mentioned George Wallace running for president in the 1960s. In the 1960s, a lot of the Democrats were pro-segregationists. And we saw George Wallace's run for presidency lead a lot of those Southern Democrats to no longer identify with the Democratic Party and realign with the Republican Party. This party realignment has persisted to date. Of course, we do not have any Republican candidates or voters advocating, well, maybe one or two, as we have one or two voters that advocate for everything you could ever imagine, but nobody realistically advocating for pro-segregationist policies. But we do see this divide in which the Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party and realigned with the Republican Party, persisting today, although represented through different policy issues. Now, what is party de-alignment? Well, if party realignment is when a significant number of voters leaves one party and realigns with the other, de-alignment is when they would leave one party and not identify with either of the two primary political parties. This is often an initial step to a party realignment. When George Wallace ran as a third party candidate and we saw the Southern Democrats vote for a third party candidate, you saw a period of party de-alignment. Following that, when he no longer ran during the next presidential term, we saw party realignment as those people who left the Democratic Party started voting for the Republican Party at large. Now, there's another way we can see political landscapes change that is separate from party de-alignment or realignment. This is considered tipping. Think of the same thing but on a smaller scale. So think of it this way. You live in a small community. Everybody tends to vote the same way. You think of not even as small as Kalispell, Montana, but let's get a little smaller. Think of Libby, Montana. Always votes Republican. That's fine. Good. That's what they think and they believe. But let's imagine, and this has happened in Oregon. It has not happened in Montana. But let's imagine a cult moves into Libby, Montana. Fascinating. They're weirdos living in the country. They bought a little bit of land. They're doing their own thing. But this cult keeps on recruiting. And they keep successfully recruiting. And thousands of people move to this farm, this community, this town in Libby, Montana to be a part of this collective. But they are in direct opposition when it comes to political viewpoints than the people who lived there prior. And this population can grow and consistently grow so gradually over time to the point where they become the majority of the voting population. And they significantly change the political landscape of Libby, Montana, because they grew so much in size, they just created a different demographic of the area. That is an example of tipping, growing in size over time, large enough to change the political balance in a district. There's a fascinating Netflix. I was big many years ago, but people don't really watch it anymore. I forget exactly what, I think it was like Wild Wild West or something along those lines. And it was a cult, everybody dressed in orange. That's the one way you can remember. And they all followed this one individual who moved to the U.S. from India, but they moved to Oregon into a small town, and they had a commune, and they grew so much in size that they started electing their own members to the local government instead of the individuals who had lived in that area for generations. So another way the political landscape can change through political parties. We also see that one soft way political landscape can change is through just unique third-party candidates. That's why we talked about third-party candidates in the last few slides. Or not even just third-party candidates, but unique candidates at large. So Bernie Sanders, a great example of if he dedicated to running as an independent, would have provided significant schism to the political party landscape on the national scale. Donald Trump is a great example of a unique candidate that created a shift within the Republican Party. I would argue many political scientists have not yet identified this as a party realignment because there hasn't been a significant enough shift and not enough from a specific demographic. But we see that Donald Trump revealed a significant shift within the Republican Party on their party platform and the way they run for office and then campaign for the presidency. So the political party landscape can change, and I would generalize it in three ways. Just actions of elected individuals, that first bullet point, or we can see it through party realignment or de-alignment, or through a tipping process in which we have populations growing in size. The takeaway from this slide is to remember the definition of party realignment, party de-alignment, and tipping. What did we learn? Here are all the questions I asked you at the beginning. I will not read this out to you because, well, I've already basically done all of this. So if you have any questions about the what did we learn slides, email me. I will immediately respond and get back to you with some explanations. And I always love engagement. So let's keep going back and forth and talk about what I covered in these lectures. Here's the answer to the what did we learn slides. And now, what is due this week? So this week we have discussion posts, as we always do. We're not taking breaks on discussion posts until the final week of the semester. We also see we have our readings. There are a lot of things posted on Eagle Online, and if you listen to the lecture, you know you don't have to read them all. You don't have to read through the DNC or the RNC party platforms, but you do have to go through the other readings 1980s call for political parties helps you have a perspective on how political parties are constantly shifting. There was a call for more political polarization in the 1950s that developed to the idea represented in that reading. And then we also have a reading that gives you a general overview of some of the functions of political parties. Review the PowerPoints. And so there's a PowerPoint, the one you just listened to if you're here. And there's another one that I did not record anything on top of, but I did post on Eagle Online, which I give you multiple detailed tips on how to write your midterm assignment, gave you the requirements for the assignment, and really everything I thought could be valuable for you as you work on this. So if there's any gaps in understanding or your ability to go from that PowerPoint to writing a solid one-page submission, please reach out to me. If you write over one page, I will deduct your points on your grade. It is not about the purpose of these assignments is meeting the requirements, not about showing me how great you are, if that makes sense. So make sure you meet the requirements. You don't want to go over just as much as you don't want to go under. So make sure you provide one page and go through all the requirements. Make sure you do this correctly and reach out with any questions. Thank you guys. Another good week. Next week, more fun, and we'll be done with that midterm. And when you finish submitting your midterm, give me like a week, 2 weeks to get detailed comments back to you. I'm going to spend at least an hour on grading every single midterm you submit. So just go easy on me because there's 30 of y'all. I have other classes and I want to make sure you have adequate commentary on how to build this midterm submission into your final paper. So thank you guys. And yeah, have a good rest of your week.